Hello, everybody. This is Gary Benoit with another episode of Beyond the Cover. And today we're excited to have with us Professor Steve Byas, who teaches government and history at Randall University in Oklahoma. Steve wrote one of the two cover story articles that we have in the September 20 issue of the New American Magazine. And Steve, the particular article you wrote having to do with what's now happening in Afghanistan, the terrible debacle there, is an article entitled The Perils of Internationalism and Nation Building. And so my question is, you're using the word perils. Why is that? Is nation building a bad thing? Is internationalism a bad thing?
Well, I think interventionism, internationalism are all kind of tied together there, and nation building. And first off, I would say that what's happening in Afghanistan is a horrible human tragedy. However, horrible human tragedies take place all over the globe because human nature is flawed all over the globe. And like in communist China, you have over 1 million people, political prisoners, and no one seriously thinks that we should invade communist China to try to free those 1 million prisoners. What happens is that I would say, at least since the progressive era, there have been Americans think that what we need to do is use our economic and military power to affect events around the world. And the perils of interventionism and nation building is that, once you get the genie out of the bottle of war and intervention, it takes courses that you may not be able to predict. And I think that our interventions over the years have tended to make things worse rather than better. That's why I call the perils of interventionism and nation building.
Now, in your article, Steve, the opening photograph happens to be a photo of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, and it shows him accepting the surrender of the Japanese in 1945 aboard the USS Missouri. And you do make the point that MacArthur had the respect, the love of the Japanese people, and when he was a virtual dictator in Japan, that worked pretty well. But why was that? And how would you compare or contrast that with the nation-building attempts that followed?
Well, I think because what General MacArthur was able to accomplish in Japan was so successful, that has led to a lot of Americans to accept this idea that we can just build a nation from scratch. But, in Japan, MacArthur, it was, because something turned out well doesn't mean it had to have turned out well. And one of the things that MacArthur opposed, for example, was the putting the emperor on trial, because MacArthur was looking more the long view of what's going to happen down the road. And he felt like there was a better chance of Japan being a successful country afterwards if we didn't put the emperor on trial. And one of the differences between what MacArthur did in Japan and what some of our other bright men, or wise men as they call them, or whatever, have done is they want to impose all of our values on these countries, whatever those values happen to be. And they don't really look at the difference in the cultures and that sort of thing. The culture changed in Japan, but it didn't completely change. We didn't try to undermine their traditions and that sort of thing that weren't a problem. And so I would say that, yes, it was successful, but most of our interventions in nation building have not been successful.
What would you say to those people, Steve, who make the claim that if you're American foreign interventionism. You're anti-sending the troops to other parts of the globe to fight in various wars. That means you're anti the American soldier.
Well, that is probably one of the silliest arguments of the whole thing, is that we ask our American soldiers to defend our country and defend our way of life. And by sending them over into harm's way, all we're doing is causing them to get killed, get wounded, severe emotional problems, and all that sort of thing. And so I would contend that using American forces only when it's necessary to defend our own country is really supporting the American soldier. It's not supporting an American soldier to send him over to places like the Middle East or Southeast Asia and get killed for some grandiose scheme, cooked up by somebody out of the Brookings Institute, or that type.
I know when we went into Korea and also when we went into Vietnam, that a lot of people believe that the purpose of those interventions were to fight communism. But how do you fight communism? Is that the best way? And also, does it make sense to send troops halfway around the world? I mean, if that is the way to fight communism, why weren't troops sent to Castro's Cuba?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, obviously, Cuba was more of a threat to the United States and then Vietnam. But the way they chose to, like in Vietnam, for example, that Robert McNamara, our Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson and earlier under Kennedy, they wanted to make South Vietnam a showcase for democracy in Asia. Well, first off, there's a problem with the word democracy, but anyway, they wanted to. They said, well, we're going to pour all this money, and we're going to build hospitals, and we're going to build schools, and we're going to build roads, and all these other countries in Asia will look to South Vietnam and say, hey, man, that's what we want instead of communism. That's rather naive. But what shocks me is that this was the same argument that was used in Iraq, if you remember, that we're going to make Iraq a showcase for democracy in the Middle East. And in the case of Iraq, especially, as horrible a monster as Saddam Hussein was, he was no threat to the United States. He was, and what has happened for people in Iraq, the situation is worse, especially for Christians and Muslims that are in the minority there. And you see some of the same type of thing that was said in Vietnam. Do you remember in Vietnam that they were going to use rolling thunder bombing, if you remember that? Well, and here I'm watching television when we're in Iraq, and our Secretary of Defense during the Iraq War said, we're going to use shock and awe. Well, it's just a different word for the same thing. And it's always sold to the American people this is going to be an easy deal. It is not an easy deal because a lot of people, even though they may not like their own rulers, they don't like foreigners coming in and telling them what to do. It'd be like going to somebody's neighbor and intervening in a domestic.
Now, you said, Steve, that there is a problem with there's a problem with democracy. What is the problem with democracy?
Well, the problem with democracy is that it's majority rule, and that is not necessarily compatible with liberty unless the majority are in favor of liberty. If you have a situation like you have in Iraq or Afghanistan, then you just vote in all these things that are and against liberty, and the minority gets just run over by the majority. There is no guarantee of religious liberty or economic liberty or political liberty. In those cases, it's the majority rules, and it's mob rule. And there's no due process of law. I mean, the due process is whatever the majority want. And so our founders, fortunately, did not establish a democracy. They established a republic. Now, we're democratic in that we have elections, but there are limits to what the majority can do under the United States Constitution. And unfortunately, that didn't happen in Iraq and some other places that we've intervened.
Okay, now somebody on the left would argue that what you're arguing for, since you're against this military interventionism and you're against, exporting our form of government, they would view you as an isolationist. And in fact, during World War II, for instance, people were called isolationists, particularly prior to the war, if they were against going abroad, for example, to fight Hitler. So how do you feel about that terminology, isolationism?
Well, America has always had, starting with George Washington, continuing with Adams and Jefferson, and all through the 19th century, generally a policy of what I would call non-interventionism. That's a little different than isolationism. Isolationism means we don't have any economic relationship. We don't have any cultural relationship. That would more describe what Japan was at one time, But the United States has never been really isolationist in that we've always had relations with the rest of the world. George Washington, I think it was, said we need to have, commerce and trade and have cultural relationship. But as John Quincy Adams said, we should not go around the world looking for monsters to destroy, because you know what? There's a whole lot of monsters out there, and it's going to get a lot of soldiers killed, and it's going to burn up the treasury of the United States. And at the end of the day, look what we've got in Afghanistan. It was very predictable, really, how it wound up.
Now, there are some historians, Steve, who would say that isolationism was responsible for World War II. You yourself are an historian, and I'm sure you would not say that. But who were the culprits in World War II? Would you say Hitler was one of the culprits, and was Hitler an isolationist?
Well, Hitler was certainly no isolationist. He expanded beyond Germany's borders, and of course you had Stalin. And all the things that millions of people that he killed in the Soviet Union. No one said, hey, we need to go over the Soviet Union and overthrow Joseph Stalin. Hitler and Stalin were both horrible human beings, horrible systems. But George Bush in his second inaugural said that we need to end tyranny in the world. Well, that'd be great, end tyranny in the world, but you're going to have to be prepared to lose an awful lot of American lives trying to do that, bankrupt the country, if we're going to be sending soldiers everywhere in the world that there's tyranny. In fact, I would say that we need to end what's going on in our own government. Some of the things our own government does that inhibit liberty in the United States. Maybe then we can worry about the rest of the world. But John Quincy Adams said we should be an example to the rest of the world. We shouldn't be doing it by force of arms. It's just not going to work. There's only so many soldiers and all that, and it just can't be done that way.
Okay, and I think it's safe to say that during most of American history, the United States was an example. And presumably that's why so many people wanted to come here. But one final question, how about today? Do you think America's becoming less an example? And if so, what can we do to make America that shining example that hopefully other countries could benefit from and apply to their own cultures, their own countries?
Unfortunately, America has become an example of big government. And before, and even today, we've had millions of people coming to the United States over the course of time because they want to live in, quote, a free country and an economic opportunity and all of that. When they had the revolutions in South America, one of the South American patriots, Miranda, he said, guys, we have two examples. French Revolution, the American Revolution. We need to follow the example of the American Revolution here in South America. And that's what I think we can do more good by just being an example. We can by sending soldiers all over.
Thank you very much, Steve. We really appreciate the article that you did for the New American. It's in the September 20 issue of the New American magazine. And we encourage everybody to go to the newamerican.com. And also, if you want to get the magazine, find out how to subscribe and so forth, look at the description beneath this video. Thank you very much.